Hello, Teresa Heffernan.
Hi, Tim. Nice to see you.
Thank you for making time with me. Uh,
Happy
I,
to.
I will introduce you and we'll see if I get this right. You are a professor of English and of English language and English literature at St. Mary's University here in Halifax. You have worked on literary theory, posthumanism, feminist theory, but now you're concentrating primarily on how robotics and artificial intelligence are shaped by science fiction. Do I have that right?
Yeah, or even fiction. I wouldn't even put science there, but just fiction. Yeah.
Okay. I had great fun reading your papers. They were super engaging and just, I was taking notes left and right. And more than that, just made me think about stuff. I thought where we might start is just, we have this giant field of artificial intelligence and relatedly robotics. And I had always heard this before, but you were really getting into the weeds about how it's informed by or even shaped by was, I think the word you used, this some fictional accounts. And the one you started with in one of your papers is well, lots of these are satires or critical takes on capitalism or society in general, which seems to get missed in the translation into the industries. And you start with, do you pronounce it Irwan?
Erewhon. Yeah.
On the
Samuel Butler's Erewhon. Yeah. From the Victorian period.
yeah. So tell me about that.
Uh, okay. Well, maybe I'll just explain a bit about how I got into this. Early 2000s. I mean, I had been working on Apocalypse. I'd been working on end of the world narratives. And I started to see um, I started to see this connection between, oh, well, actually, what happened is I started reading like popular science journals, and they became much more exciting than the fiction I was reading. And I thought, well, what happened there? And what is this human like intelligence and these human like robots that they're developing? And how does that work? And what do they mean by intelligence? And so then I started to read some of the science to figure out what the models were, and I kept coming against references to fiction. And I thought, fiction is not something that uh, fiction is not something that you can just substitute for science. They work very differently. So I did get a research grant, and I spent a lot of time traveling around. I went to Japan, stayed at the Robot Hotel, um, went to Ishiguro, who's one of the most famous roboticists in the world. Went to see his Geminoids. Interviewed people had lunch with Jeffrey Hinton to ask him about his model of intelligence. And I realized in the doing all this research that that they were using fiction sort of to market this idea of intelligence, but they weren't really explaining how the intelligence was working. So, for instance, when I interviewed Hinton, I said to him, like, okay, so what is your model of intelligence? And he said, well, Teresa, once I have enough neural nets, it's going to spring into consciousness. His computer is going to spring into consciousness. And I thought, well, you know, first of all, given we know like so little about the brain, how is it that you imagine yourself as creating this intelligence? But when I started to kind of research in the field, and that's where Erewhon comes in, one of the fathers of AI is Alan Turing. So he's known as Alan Turing, and he wrote a paper in the 1950s, and it was about machine thinking. And he was also working 1940s, 1950s, but he was also kind of looking at he was also using a lot of fiction as the kind of basis of his model of machines. Alan Turing was known to be a very literal reader. So he was such a literal reader that he had been working, of course, at Bletchley Park on cracking the codes of the Enigma machine, cracking codes for Nazi codes. But when he, but after the war, he went to the States. He was invited by universities to the States. He got on, they told him, you can't bring anything. This is all top level secret. You know, you can't bring any kind of British intelligence with you. But he took that command so literally that he showed up in New York on the ship with absolutely nothing. Uh, I mean, nothing in his, nothing in his. He didn't even have ID, so they just chucked him like, who are you? They were asking like, who are you? And so they just like checked him into, a waiting pin till someone could waiting pen, sorry, till someone could kind of vouch for him. But that literalness that he had, where he took instructions very literally, as I say, he would do the same thing with fiction. And if you look at his early work, what he's referencing often is Erewhon. Erewhon is a novel, it's a Victorian novel by Samuel Butler. It was a satire. It was a satire. So Butler had just read Darwin, and he was looking at this model of evolution, and he thought, well, it would be kind of fun to just, as a joke, as a specious analogy, as he calls it, apply it to machines. So he creates this whole society where these machines start to evolve. And then eventually they're going to take over. So this society decides remember, this is in the 1870s, decides to destroy all machines, for the past 290 years or something. And there are these huge, long debates about these machines coming to life. It was all a satire, as I say. But when you look at Turing, it's referenced in his bibliographies. And then at one point, he says, it's just as Butler says, these machines are going to kind of evolve and take over. So it's a difference about like how you read fiction, right? So as someone trained in fiction, I read it within as fiction, as not true. That's the
Yeah.
definition of fiction, as not true, but really useful, but you have to kind of analyze it and think, okay, what's going on here? What's happening?
We see this time and again, all these
Yeah.
guys looking at science fiction, fiction, and picking out the wrong stuff. Like they're missing all the humanity and they just look at the machines where many of these novels are incredibly deep, complex human stories, and that's just all ditched. And they look at this technology that's used as kind of a gimmick or something to advance the story and not which is more important than the technology. I was struck that Turing um, did all this work in decoding and is, creating this technology. And much the same way he only picks up the technology from literature. There's this, he has this kind of dual life himself where uh, he's got this complex private life. He's a homosexual who's condemned for it and made to sterilize, and he ultimately commits suicide over this. But it's as if he denied his own humanity in order to build the machine. Is that reading too
I
much into
think
it?
there's a great novel by William Eves called Murmur, and it's about an avatar, Alex Pryor, but it's based on Alan Turing. It's a fantastic novel. It's really wonderful, and what Will Eves imagines is that when Turing has to undergo this chemical castration because he's seen as a kind of um, that his homosexuality is seen as kind of you know, problematic for the British military. So they condemn him to this chemical castration or jail. And this is after he's helped the war effort. And so he ends up committing suicide. What Eves does is kind of reimagine that as thinking about how um, how Turing had to have this kind of deep secrecy. Like if you read for instance, the Imitation Game, or the Turing Game, or the Turing Machine, known as, but it's the Imitation Game, which is the kind of basis of computer science, and this idea of creating this thing that imitates. But if you actually read Turing's paper, he substitutes thinking with imitation. And then what he does is he also substitutes then it's also about deception, because it which is fine within the parameters of a game. You can be deceptive, but that whole model is based, like, what happens when we take that model, which is what this AI industry has done, take that model of imitation and take that model of deception and unleash it on the world, without the kind of context of fiction or game or performance. I mean, it ends up with, what do we end up with? We end up with deep fakes. We end up with this manipulation. We end up with this, huge problem that we've encountered, that we're encountering now, with this AI industry. But what Turing does, or what Eves does, is kind of reimagine Turing in a much more, looking at this kind of life of deception that he himself had to lead because of the conditions in when he was writing, and the laws against homosexuality. And then looks at, like, he would have to face his body also, that is kind of changing. And so he starts to think of the body as less this kind of mechanical thing, and think of it as much more of being, in this body that has emotions, and is witnessing this change that Turing hated. Turing was a runner, and this kind of chemical castration caused him to grow breasts, caused him to, all sorts of weight gain, all sorts of disturbing things for him. So Eves imagines it through those lenses. But I think the other thing that Eves is really good upon, and I think that this gets lost in a lot of this talk about AI, is how obsessed it is, like how much it comes from kind of grief. And Alan Turing had his first love, Christopher. When he was young, Christopher died of tuberculosis. And it was that, you can read Turing's letters to Christopher's mother about this death. And it's like, there's deep grief there. And it's this idea with not being able to handle that grief, not being able to handle that death. So then fantasizing about, creating a kind of mechanical replacement, or shutting down those emotions. I mean, you get to people like Ray Kurzweil, it's the same thing with he's the talks about the singularity, writes about the singularity, was an early extropian, which we can talk about later. But Turing too, his father died suddenly, and Turing has been trying to recreate his father, since that. And there's one part in a film on Turing, a documentary, or sorry, on Kurzweil, where they're going by a graveyard, and he says it's great that there's all this DNA, because we'll be able to resurrect people. And it is this kind of fantasy, it's like this fantasy of overcoming death. You can go to Peter Thiel, he's obsessed with Tolkien. He says at one point, in an interview, they talk about, because he invests all this money in the immortality industry, which I've also written about. But he invests all this money, Peter Thiel does, and Thiel says, so the interviewer asks him, like, well, you've got this interest in immortality, and he says, yes, well, the hobbits are in Tolkien are immortal. And again, it's like, that's fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, There's so much to say. I think of Elon Musk. He's famously a terrible reader of fiction. He takes all the wrong lessons from everything he's ever read. Like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is his. Uh, he says he loves it, and he doesn't understand a word of it. It's making fun of people like him, and he embraces it. And Kim Stanley Robinson, same, socialist, and he embraces that stuff. I don't know. It just amazes me that all of these guys, Teal, Altman, the rest of them, they find these fictional accounts and they read it 180 degrees wrong from the way it was intended, and it just amazes
Well,
me.
and picking up on the Hitchhiker's Guide, there Demis Hassabis too, who's head of DeepMind at Google. He also is inspired he was inspired by Hitchhiker's Guide, Deep Thought, the computer in Hitchhiker's Guide. That's where Demis Hassabis gets the name for DeepMind. And DeepMind's mission at Google is to solve intelligence and then use intelligence to solve everything else. That's the motto for,
The
and you can
ultimate.
read you can read this hilarious exchange between or I found it hilarious between so Demis Hassabis is looking for money and Teal gives him some money and then he says, you should go visit Musk because he would also he might also, which he ends up doing, end up funding you. So Demis Hassabis goes to Musk and Musk says, no, sorry, man, I'm interested in going to Mars and I'm setting up a colony on Mars, so I'm not interested. And the Demis Hassabis says, yeah, but what if an artificial intelligence follows you to Mars and destroys you there? And Musk's response is, "Oh, I hadn't thought of that." And so there you go. I mean, as I say, it's like a kind of B plot movie or something. It's like, where is the science here? Where is the science?
The ultimate joke in Hitchhiker's Guide is that the computer is assigned to find the meaning in life, and it works for, the entire history of the Earth or whatever, and comes back with a meaningless statement, 42, and the joke is that computers cannot be understand humanity. And it again, they missed the plot completely.
Yeah, or I have I go back and forth with this. How much of this is they use fiction as a way of marketing the technology because it sells? You tell this seductive story, and people think, "Oh, is that right?" Like I remember thinking, reading this early stuff in the early 2000s, thinking, "Oh, really? We're going to have like human-like intelligence? How are you doing that?" So you get sort of seduced by the story. But then you got to ask, well, but what do they mean by intelligence? How does this work? And with the 42, that answer of the 42, if you think about how generative AI, so AI, as Emily Bender and Alex Hanna have talked about, is like a marketing term. It's like they have a book called The AI Con, but it is like a marketing term. So it embraces all these different types of technology. So, like, what are we talking about? So if we're talking about generative AI, which is what most people are talking about now with chatbots, what it's doing is just, translating, it's assigning numbers to words and then doing the statistical prediction, which is why people think, oh, why does it get things wrong? Because it just go look at things up on the internet? No, that's not how it works. The way that it's working is that it's computing. Doing all these mathematical computations. And so that's why you get the huge energy costs, and why we're doing this is beyond me. We could just use our words rather than going through and turning them into this mathematical, calculation, or requiring on these kind of mathematical formulas. But there's something like deep seated there that's like faith in math as some sort of secret to the universe, as opposed to another kind of symbolic way that we interpret the world.
Yeah. When I read your work, I mean, well, you state explicitly that science can actually solve or help address very real problems that we have in the world, climate change.
Absolutely.
You know, and you list, bicycles, renewable power, taking transit, better that could address a real problem, existential problem that we have. But instead, it's being used to create these fictions, um, downloading our brains into machines and having uh, fake worlds orbiting different stars, and this fiction that will never be achieved, is not achievable in any event. Um, and it's just it's maddening. It's just really maddening. In much the same way, when I read you, I think they've decided to imbue the machine with life. That's their goal. And at the same time, actual humanity's being deprived of life. It's kind of they use humanity as a model for the machine, and yet the reverse is happening too. It, and
Yeah, I mean, I think that another, as I say, I've worked on the immortality industry, and one of the things that strikes me about that is this, like, you know, this fantasy of wanting to live forever or to live like really long lives, to kind of keep hacking biology. And it's a sense of like really trying to master nature. And what I in when I was going around interviewing all these people about AI and robotics, it really did strike me how this was such a huge distraction from actually climate change and the climate crisis, the environmental crisis that we're on. And so it was a way, and if you look at the kind of, the way that this developed through people like Brockman, who had the Edge Foundation. So that was funded by Jeffrey Epstein. A lot of this, there's a close relationship between Jeffrey Epstein and the AI industry, which we can kind of talk about. But Brockman was funded by him. Then when you're looking at the way that Brockman, so that the idea was to replace in Brockman's view the literati with the digerati. But really, when you're looking at it, Brockman was having his millionaire dinners and then his billionaire dinners. And it was all with people from Google, from Facebook. They were all sort of there, uh, promoting this idea of this, techno optimism, that we were going to be able to master nature, that we were going to be able to master humans. But it was really like pushed so much by this uh, corporations, and you can see now like that relationship between the AI industry and the oil industry, for instance, like what the AI industry is saying is like we have these huge energy demands because of this. We're driving up energy demands because we've got this. Because we have to have all this compute. What are we computing? Why are we doing this? We don't really know. But what they're saying, and Google says this now, after promising us that they would be net zero, they're now saying, well, what's wrong with fossil fuels? So they're actually right aligned now with a lot of the oil industry, and they're sort of working together. So the AI industry says we need all this energy, can't possibly be um, can't possibly be fueled by renewables. But if you look at the way the concern from the oil industry, of course, is that renewables are much cheaper in price. For a long time, the oil industry was saying, no, renewables are too expensive. Now renewables have really dropped in
yeah,
cost.
yeah,
So you've got this. So how do you get around that? Well, you drive up energy demands. So that's what's happening is you see this kind of very scary
You
relationship of these
Yeah, you
industries.
write about the history of this fiction and as part of um, really the imperialist project, and I was struck by the parallels between your analysis of that and Karen Howe's book Empire of AI, that
Fantastic.
artificial intelligence as an industry works as an empire does, taking over as much as it can. You care
Yeah,
to-
taking over resources, taking over. I mean, a lot of people say, "Oh, AI is taking over jobs." It's not taking over jobs. It's restructuring the labor market. So you have all these kind of piecemeal workers across the globe, fueling, like doing all the kind of editing behind the machines, the editing, the categorizing, the testing of these machines behind the scenes. So what you've done is just kind of you say, "Oh, I'm going to use AI because it's going to make me more efficient." No, what you're doing is depending on a huge global labor force, and it's really about that's hidden behind the machines. And so the corporations are like, "Oh, look what my machine can do." No, it's like zillions of humans behind the
Well,
scenes that are doing this.
let's talk about that. You have the magic chatbot or supposed
Yeah,
AI, which is sold as it's this magical life of itself. But in reality, they're all mechanical Turks to some degree. I remember Musk's robot that was actually a guy in a suit.
yeah,
Um, and the Amazon stores were the thousand guys in India, were doing all the camera work. And even the autonomous cars are all people behind them, on and on and on. And so that's just one element, but then you have the people training the AI models, the generative AI models. I'm going to do a whole uh, episode on that alone, which is
great, great.
Karen Howe talks about these people. You don't want your chat GTP or your video generators to create rape or child sex scenes or any of this. So these poor people or in the developing world are
Yeah,
going
and
through all this
can
imagery and are being harmed mentally to
absolutely.
weed that stuff out. And then there's people working in mines or communities that are being destroyed by mines to extract the metals that are required for this, and again, climate change, which affects all of humanity. All that's hidden in the magical little AI chatbot or whatever. Um,
Absolutely. That the whole kind of way, and the industry has been really good at kind of concealing that. They don't say, "Oh, here, we're using all this kind of labor." No, that's all contracted out. So yes, you have like when you think about the way that these large language models work, they download everything on the internet, and so that is including all the kind of videos of rapes or murders or child sexual abuse or horrible things that are on the internet, and that all has to be kind of edited out, and that's what these people spend their days doing. It's the same with Facebook, right? It's the same way that Facebook has worked for a long time. And it's hugely damaging. So rather than, the thing is, like, you're completely kind of, as I say, restructuring the labor force. So what are we doing? We've got all these humans behind the scenes who are poorly paid, who are in these kind of exploitive situations, producing more and more money for corporations that are valued at, well, all the billionaires that own the technology. A lot of people think that the AI, the chatbots or whatever, that they're yeah, I mean, you have to look at them as the kind of products of a very already concentrated industry. And you might think, "Oh, ed tech is different." No, ed tech, if you kind of look at how the ed tech models work, education technology, which is being pushed so heavily in schools and universities. But if you look at how it's related, it all comes back to one of a kind of dependence on Google or one or OpenAI or one Microsoft, one of the big tech companies.
Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of a restructuring, and maybe you could speak to that. You talk about a revised or a new feudalism that this kind of
A neo
reordering of the economic order.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I mean, when you look at, what are we all doing as humans when you engage with a chatbot or when you're behind the scenes working on a chatbot? You're servicing these magical machines, and we're all kind of working this kind of digital land, this digital world in order to make corporations money, big tech companies more money or billionaires more money. And those billionaires now have all sorts of fantasies about how they want to, restructure the world in pretty scary ways. So what is it, so what we end up all doing is just like serfs, right? In the kind of feudal order, there were serfs who that was an agricultural model, but made money for a lot of the kind of elite, the landlords, the aristocrats, right? They were just tilling the land. And we're doing the same sort of thing in the digital world. Whether you're engaging with a chatbot, I mean, you're training it all the time, every time that you engage with it.
And both had a overarching religion, if you will,
Absolutely.
Catholicism in the Middle Ages, and this sort of AI religion. It's a faith that's kind of imposed on the rest of us. And
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you look at, like, there was Lewandowski who was working on autonomous cars, but he created this Church of AI in LA. So there was this like Church of AI. Anyway, he ended up going to jail for fraud, but then Trump pardoned him in the last Trump session. He pardoned him, and so he was out of jail. But this kind of religious over this idea here. Let me show you my magical machine. Schmidt, who was the ex head of Google, who used to be the CEO of Google, and now is involved in all these military startups. But he would say, like, it's going to be a magical age. And it's all about this kind of like, song and dance and distract. And here, let me show you how great these are, and no explanation of how these things actually work.
yeah, um, I'm always struck at how vapid the lives of these people are. Yeah, they're fabulously wealthy or whatever, but they don't seem to have much of a, Musk famously hates his child who's a trans person, and it's hard to see any love there, for anyone, any artistic appreciation, any pain even, or there's no humanity there, and I just I always think they've created this vision of immortality, um, of nothing, of a soulless immortality, if you will. And just speaking for myself, death is the thing that gives us life meaning. It's the fact that we're only here for a short period of time, and then it's gone, and well, maybe we should appreciate what we're doing here, and figure out. And they seem to actually hate humanity. I don't know. I just wanted to throw that out there. But you have uh kind of one thing that we I think have to point out is that there's all sorts of fictions out there in the globe that are ignored. I have no idea what East Asian or South Asian or African science fictions look like, but there's feminist science fiction and all this, and uh, we're talking about a very narrow range of fictions that are picked up by these people. And you have two counter examples. I guess one's not fiction, but you talk about the play. Are
Well,
you?
RUR,
Yeah, can you talk
or the
about
term.
that?
Yeah, so RUR is a play from 1920s or 1920, and it's written by Karl Čapek, who was a Czechoslovakian. So he, there he is, off in Prague, very cosmopolitan in the early part of the century, in the early part of the 20th century, and the First World War breaks out. He writes RUR after the war, so it's 1920, after the Great War. And there was all the promise, of course, of this, that life would get better with the Industrial Revolution. So in the 19th century, child mortality rates, just because doctors started to wash their hands, but child mortality rates started to drop. They were dealing with issues like child labor. They had, in factories. So life expectancy was going up, things were getting better. But then you have, in the midst of that kind of uh, optimistic narrative about technology and life getting better, this catastrophic event of the First World War. And Čapek was very aware about the kind of complicity of a lot of the scientists who signed on to the war industry and were creating things like chemical gas and we had the aerial bombing and that kind of thing, machine guns, all these things that started. And so he was looking at that mechanization of life. And in the play it is a comedy, but it ends with the end of the world. It is this kind of group of men who get together and they decide that they want to give birth to a machine. And the machine in the play, and that's what's lost often, is the machine is actually organic. It's not mechanical. And what it is it's producing in factories. So he's looking at the whole kind of beginnings of automation, right? Which a lot of this AI stuff is just automation disguised as intelligence. They're just automated. It's just automation.
And the word itself, robot, com-
Robot, yeah. So
comes from.
robot comes from robota, which is a Czech word for like serf or slave. And it's this idea of, so as I say, these humans that, or these mechanical, these machines that they've developed are actually organic, they're biological, but they've been stripped of anything, anything that would interfere with the idea of them being these productive workers. So that's the idea behind the play.
Yeah, it's striking that the one thing that gets lifted out of that play is the robot, unattached to any of this other meaning of the play. And so we get the Asimov and then all this stuff happening today about robots with not understanding that this
The
was a
origins of the term. Yeah.
yeah, this was a critique of exactly the world we're creating. The
Yeah, it's
other
absolutely a critique of automation, of coming out of the war, of all the spending on military, because it was disastrous and meanerous, the First
yeah,
World War, absolutely meaningless.
yeah.
Um,
I
you
don't think we can uh, understate just how terrible that cataclysmic World War, the First War was.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Um,
And he was a young guy in before the war started. Here he was, this young guy, like interested in kind of intellectual life and in this cosmopolitan world he's living. Prague was a bit like Paris, but then this kind of disastrous war. So he's looking at the kind of reasons behind that, and he says that we have to create. He talks about in an interview. Chapek talks about we created robots because it is a war machine, like it is a product of war. And when you look at the whole military funding from of the AI industry, which is the kind of origins of that funding,
yeah.
and then when you look at people like Thiel with Palantir, uh, creating, autonomous weapons, something I've also talked about, which I say, in fact, that's a myth. They're not autonomous, right? There's a whole infrastructure that produces these weapons. They're automated, and the way that automation. So if you look at the Geneva Conventions, for instance, there are regulations about automated weapons. By calling these autonomous weapons, it tries to bypass those regulations, right? And yeah,
Huh.
that's a whole other discussion,
Yeah,
autonomous weapons.
I hadn't queued into that. The through your writing, there, I mean, you note that all these guys in the AI Titans are guys. They're men.
Yeah,
And Musk has uh, engineered it such that all his children were born biological boys, and um, you talk about Turing, turning his machine, which started as a male-female thing, but the male was the the essence of it. But where I really wanted to go with this, in all that context, you talk about, is it Ada Lovelace?
Ada Lovelace. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Can you talk about her?
Yeah, so Ada Lovelace, 19th century. If anyone wants a good reference, there's this great graphic novel called The Thrilling Adventures of Lovelace and Babbage, and it's by Sidney Padua. But it's absolute. She's is absolutely brilliant, and it's a whole kind of takedown of um, it's a whole critique anyway of some of these models. But Ada Lovelace was the daughter of Lord Byron, and Ada Lovelace's mother was so horrified by Byron that she took Ada as a baby, and they escaped. And and she brought Ada up as a mathematician, and Ada met Babbage, who was developing the analytical engine, which is often people talk about that as the first computer. And what the brilliant thing that Ada realized was, well, you could do it didn't just have to be numbers. You could kind of substitute any symbols here. And so that she wrote what is considered, or imagine what is considered the first computer program. But the other thing Ada said is, like, we have to really be careful not to invest this model. And the model, when you actually read about Babbage and the difference engine and then the analytical engine, when you read about that kind of model, it's exactly the same as Turing's model is exactly the same of what we have now. What we have now is more computing speed. So people talk about this evolution, of AI. It's not evolving. It's the same model, right? You've got information, you've got storage, and you've got computing power. Those three things are all there in the 19th century model, Babbage's model. But what you don't have, of course, is the compute or the storage space, or, you know, I mean, we also have lots of fancy algorithms. What, uh, but what Ada said was, we have to really be careful not to kind of invest these machines with ever producing any sort of truth, or ever being capable of analysis. And when Turing's writing, he's got a whole section on his paper of the Lovelace objection. The Lovelace objection is to say, no, Lovelace is wrong about that. These machines are creative. What does creativity mean anyway? And that Lovelace objection is now part of something that gets often referenced in computer science journals as kind of accepted, that Turing's objection was accepted. And I think it's really interesting. Like I talk about, I have another paper on where are the mothers of AI. And so Ada Lovelace, I mean, there's this attempt sort of to kind of reinvent her as, to attract women in STEM, or women in computers. But no one wants to actually listen to her and to kind of take her objection or to acknowledge the limits of these machines. And it's similar to people like Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell, who were both fired from Google because they were showing some of the problems with large language models or chatbots. Early on, they were showing these problems. And as soon as women speak up, it's like, sorry, you're gone, you're getting canceled, get out of here. We want our magic machines, we want our fantasy of, birthing intelligence. And it's something that Ada just never fell for. So I think that there's a real kind of use in reviving what Ada Lovelace said. She also, which is just an interesting aside, her mother would never let her go near Byron because her mother was thinking like, poetry drives you crazy. Anyway, Ada developed a gambling addiction. She died when she was fairly young in her 30s. But one thing that she wanted to be buried next to her father, whom she had never met. So she was buried with Byron, and her mother refused to go to the funeral because she wanted nothing to do with Byron. So
Well,
Ada was buried
was
in
that
her father's.
simply because he was a poet?
Well, I mean, Byron has a pretty bad reputation, like he was, but and there was kind of lots of drinking and drugs involved. And so I think the mother was just like, I need to get away as far as possible. And sort of like, rather than looking at that as a problem with Byron, was blaming poetry. So there were strict instructions never to let Ada ever near any poetry, to bring her up as a mathematician. Um,
That's just fascinating. That's our entire problem now encapsulated is trying to reduce everything to numbers and losing the poetry of life. Do you see a counter literary the chance of a counter literary tradition or building up of one to counter this nonsense that dominates or
Yeah, I mean, I think like just teach the literature. So I taught a course I taught the honor seminar last year at St. Mary's. And I just like took all the literature, like who did we start with? I think we started with Butler, Erewhon's Butler in the Book of the Machines, and looked at that in relationship to Turing. And then we looked at RUR, and we looked at Will Eves on Turing, novel on Turing, a couple of films, Spielberg's AI, and just like, okay, let's teach that, and then let's look at how the AI industry has kind of co-opted this fiction and what they've done to it. So to kind of restore the fiction to fiction. And to kind of critique this model, which there isn't a lot of science around it.
yeah, we didn't discuss how Kubrick um, basically changed his mind.
Absolutely. I think, yeah.
Yeah, from 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was the machine. Well, our future is disembodied machines to uh, artificial intelligence. The Spielberg movie, which he started.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but Kubrick started,
Yeah.
absolutely. And when you look at 2001, which is what I think 1968, so it's a year before the moon landing.
Yep.
But he was interviewing all these, like he was interviewing Marvin Minsky, also, by the way, Marvin Minsky and the MIT lab, also funded by Epstein. But and Marvin Minsky, who's also considered another father of AI, held two conferences at least on Epstein's pedophile island. Um, you know, so that's kind of one thing there. But when when Kubrick interviewed Turing about, or sorry, interviewed uh, Minsky about this, right? He kind of took, as a lot of people do, Kubrick's like, wow, okay, this must all be coming, true. We're going to have this superhuman intelligence. We're going to be like flying around space, whatever. And so he was convinced of it. And that's 2001. I mean, the film's much more complicated than a kind of unquestioned view of technology, but it is this idea of technology evolving, right? When you think about the apes throwing up the stick at the
Phone.
beginning,
Yeah.
and then it turns into a satellite. Um, so that was 68. When you read Kubrick, it sounds like people talking now. It sounds like Ray Kurzweil, like we're going to have these immortal machines and blah blah blah, and we're going to merge with machines, and we're going to be off in space exploring the cosmos. That was 68. Kubrick goes through this long by the 80s. Climate change has become a thing. The climate crisis, the recognition that fossil fuels are really kind of increasing the climate crisis. Um, you know, talk about like the environmental impact, the disappearing species. All this is since the 60s actually, but this has become much more the dominant narrative in the 80s. And whereas computers, what happened in computers, we weren't flying off into space as merged with our machines. They became this corporate product used in a lot of businesses. So Kubrick becomes much more skeptical about that, and then he's the one who begins this AI, the film AI, which is released in 2001, which is a kind of reference to his original film 2001, but it's after Kubrick's died, so Spielberg brings it out. Spielberg says he follows fairly carefully Kubrick's instructions
Yeah.
about the film. But one thing that Kubrick is talking about then is AI as a fairy tale,
Yeah.
not like as a corporate fairy tale,
I got to admit,
not as a
I'm
romantic.
unfamiliar with the film. I haven't seen it, so
Oh, okay.
I should. It's on my short list to watch. That'll be great. I had another
You should
question.
also watch Moon if you haven't seen it.
Which
Duncan
one?
Jones. Moon, if you haven't seen it, Duncan Jones. It's
Okay.
David Bowie's son who did this.
Right.
There's
Um,
just a funny story about that where he goes off. So Moon is again this kind of celebration of technology. Everything goes wrong. But the NASA invites Duncan Jones to come and talk about the film. And Duncan Jones had been reading all this stuff about, like um, Mars settlements and stuff, and I had decided that this is just a really horrible idea. So he creates this very kind of dark film when NASA is interviewing him. So they watch the film, and then the audience is at the end is asking, "So what do you think? Because we're thinking like mining the moon might be a good idea. What do you think?" Just like, first of all, and they're saying, "What do you think about the possibilities of this technology?" First of all, he's a filmmaker, But the other thing is, he's just made this film that's completely critical of the whole, of the whole kind of idea behind mining the moon, and it seems a bit lost. They're just trying to use the film as a way of kind of promoting
yeah.
mining.
One of Musk's books that he loves is Heinlein's "The Moon is a Cruel Mistress." And the plot of that is that they destroy the Earth, basically, or
Yeah.
go to another place so that you can get rid of humans. It's bizarre. One last question, and maybe you know nothing about it or haven't thought about it, but I keep returning to The Matrix.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, there's so much to there's so much to hate on the filmmakers. Lovely people did what they did. It was a tiny, but the way it's been taken as a blueprint for so much that's wrong in the world now. Um, a simple fantasy, um, has been turned into this madness that we have now. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, again, if you look at the film, I mean, when what's his name, that actor, uh, Keanu Reeves,
Yes.
when he's in there, and he's like, there's that scene where they're sitting on Earth and Earth has been destroyed, and the the character who says like, welcome. Welcome to the Real, which is this total destruction, right? And what you've got is this simulation instead. I mean, again, I think it's a whole critique, like that question, what are we doing? Because we can't, and then at the end of the film, you see what is producing all the energy is all these humans that are kind of, providing the kind of fuel for the matrix. That's what we're doing. We're being mined, right? Our data is being mined, and it's I think it's Zuboff who says this, and I always like this analogy. She says, a lot of people say that we're the product. Like that the data is our data is the product, so we are product. And she said, no, we're not product. What's happening is our data is being mined, but the human is the kind of discarded husk on the roadside. So as these companies are kind of sucking up, colonizing us as they've colonized minerals and all sorts of other things for the whole, as you were referring to earlier, the whole model of empire, of this kind of extraction economy, as we are being like, now it's the human that becomes the resource. We're being kind of sucked up and used um, for this industry. uh,
That's probably the perfect place to leave this. Where can people find you?
I have a website called Social Robot Futures, so I publish a lot of stuff on there, and there's lots of kind of reference to other good platforms.
Great. You've been very generous with your time. I really appreciate it. It's nice to meet you virtually. I don't think I've ever interacted with you before.
We did. I mean, remember you came to the 2017 Cyborg Futures conference that I had long ago? You came to St. Mary's. Anyway, that was the kind of uh, culmination to look at a lot of art. Wasn't the culmination, it was like one of the works I was looking at a lot of these issues.
Great. Well, sorry, I don't remember. I'm old and forgetful now. But thanks for your time, and I'll post this on the Examiner site, and we'll go from there. I really appreciate
Great.
it. So I will end this now.